today's event, Commissioner Dan Berkovitz. Mr. Berkovitz was nominated by President Trump to serve as a commissioner of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in April 2018. He was unanimously confirmed by the Senate in August and sworn into office in September 2018 for a 5-year term. Prior to his appointment, Mr. Berkovitz was a partner and co-chair of the Futures and Derivatives practice at the law firm WilmerHale. He was also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law School and vice chair of the American Bar Association Committee on Futures and Derivatives. Mr. Berkovitz served as a general counsel of the CFTC from 2009 to 2013. While serving in this role, he was the agency's deputy representative to the Financial Stability Oversight Council. Before the CFTC, Mr. Berkovitz was a senior staff lawyer for the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. He also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management. Joining Commissioner Berkovitz in today's fireside chat is Asaf Meir, founder and CEO of Solidus Labs. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And Asaf, I'll let you take things from here.
Thank you, Elisa. And Commissioner, an honor to have you here back in DACOM after 8 months, I believe, from the previous DACOM. In the crypto time, it's basically a decade. So great to have you. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Asaf. Thank you for the invite. It's great to be back again. It does seem 8 months. A lot has happened in 8 months in the world.
Absolutely. We have a lot of ground to cover here,
Right.
Especially as it relates to the previous discussion right now. I'd love to ask you some questions as a reference to the previous panel. But before we take a deeper dive, we have a diverse global audience with DACOM, members from different jurisdictions and regions in the globe, audience that may not come from the traditional financial industry. Would love for you maybe take a few minutes just to explain the CFTC role, specifically as it relates to crypto and digital assets, and then we can take it from there.
Yeah, thank you, Asaf. And that's important. That's an important distinction to make. So in the U.S., as I know some of your market participants are fully aware and probably frustrated by, jurisdiction over financial markets is fragmented among a number of agencies, both in terms of bank regulation, prudential regulation, and market regulation. We have bank regulators such as the Federal Reserve, the Office of Controller of the Currency. So for issues like stable coins, you talk to the banking regulators. And then we have market regulators. And there's us with the derivatives markets. And then there's the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, for the securities market. So depending on whether an asset is a securities or a commodity may depend on the agency that it'll determine the agency that you may have to deal with, or sometimes it's maybe both, or sometimes it's uncertain. So I'm with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. So my remarks today are really directed towards assets and products in our jurisdictional purview. That would be commodities. Now, commodity, it has a very broad definition under the Commodity Exchange Act. We started out with agricultural commodities, but in 1974, when the agency was created and taken out of the Department of Agriculture, it was expanded to include anything that is or may be the subject of a futures contract. So virtually any tangible or intangible commodity item can be a commodity under the Act. So it was expanded from corn and wheat and gold and silver to, in the 70s, it was developed currencies, treasury notes, interest rates, and stock indexes, and even stocks can be subject, even securities can be the subject of futures, but security futures are joint jurisdiction. So anything that's really can be the subject of a futures contract is a commodity under the Act. And so there's futures contracts on Bitcoin, and futures contracts on Ether. So under the law, not just those specific cryptocurrencies of Bitcoin or Ether are commodities, but the whole class of cryptocurrencies is considered commodities, and our enforcement actions with that taking that broad interpretive approach have been upheld in the courts. So we have a very broad definition of commodity, and we regulate the derivative markets on these commodities, which is futures, swaps, options, and leveraged, to a certain degree, leveraged retail transactions. If you do a retail transaction for the delivery of a commodity that's leveraged, that also comes within our jurisdiction. Now, in terms of the spot market, if you're just trading these things, you're going buying gold, you're buying silver, you're buying Bitcoin or whatever, just that cash market, what we call the cash market, is not subject to our regulatory jurisdiction, but we have anti-fraud and anti-manipulation authority over those markets as well. And we've brought a number of cases. We bring it frequently in currencies. Foreign currency is an area that's ripe with fraud. And unfortunately, cryptocurrency, there's significant amount of fraud in the cash market too. And we've brought a number of enforcement cases. So that's our jurisdictional interest. We regulate commodity exchanges. We regulate the trading of swaps since the Dodd-Frank Act, and commodity exchanges for futures contracts. That's what we regulate. And we regulate swap execution facilities where swaps are traded. We regulate clearing organizations where these instruments are cleared. And we regulate large market participants. We regulate the intermediaries in these markets. We regulate futures commission merchants who provide clearing services to market participants, introducing brokers, commodity trading advisors, clearing organizations, swap dealers, and we regulate the major intermediaries in these markets.
All right. Now, thank you for that context, Commissioner. It's absolutely helpful, I'm sure, for the audience to position the conversation and set the stage. So it's interesting hearing about agriculture commodities in the 70s all the way through NFTs these days, and so that also takes us into our kind of next topic. 8 months ago, during our conversation, I think we've discussed multiple different topics around crypto, digital assets, the ecosystem. DeFi was one of them. DeFi was one topic we touched upon, I believe, just a few minutes. And now it's the topic of DACOM. Trading volume have spiked almost 100x over the past year. So I wanted to ask, what have the CFTC done in that respect? How is thinking around it has evolved? Any internal, consideration has been taken into this spiked volume that we've seen over the past year?
Well, this has definitely landed on our radar screen. The explosion of trading, the new technology, and where this is going has definitely caught our attention. And so I think honestly we're trying to play somewhat catch up right now. But it's typical of the way the world works, is that the private sector will develop new technologies and make advancements and seek out applications, and we learn about it, and then people come present questions to us, or we watch the markets. So just the fantastic explosion of this, the various technologies and the uses, is something that's definitely caught our attention, that we're working through. We have many divisions within the agency touch upon the various areas. Our market oversight, our division that looks over market participants, the intermediaries. So all our various divisions are now, and we have looking into it. And we have Lab CFTC. We have a specific office that's devoted to this, with a person who's very knowledgeable in this area. Jason came out of the crypto world, and so we have an office specifically devoted to following these and acting as a liaison with the agency and helping educating folks internally. So we're devoting increased resources to it.
Yeah, so it's fair to say that the agency is allocating additional resourcing and budgets towards the not only research, but then potentially concrete, viable framework and steps that can possibly be implemented in the rise of DeFi. Exactly. And as I mentioned, the previous panel, a lot of what was discussed was, well, what does this rise even means? As market operators, right? This is still something the market is trying to kind of figure out completely. And then we're trying to also envision already the regulatory need. What would regulators need in order to feel comfortable to let this market have a good balance of safety and and innovation. So seems like the agency is putting in resources, trying to understand what's happening and how to implement eventually some frameworks around it. I mean, that's great to hear. I think that, last month I heard another keynote of you, and you mentioned, I'm going to read this out. You mentioned a system without intermediaries is a Hobbesian marketplace with each person looking out for themselves, right? Not only do I think that unlicensed DeFi markets for derivative instruments are a bad idea, I also do not see how they are legal under the Commodities Exchange Act. We've also touched upon that question last year, the question of whether regulation can work without clear intermediaries. And I think it's a big, almost, point of discussion in the world of DeFi more so than ever. How do you see possibly the world of DeFi evolving without intermediaries? Is a regulated DeFi environment even possible in your view? If it is, what are you envisioning possibly? What would be an ideal kind of outcome in that respect?
So I want to be. Let me separate out the two questions. Right now, intermediaries in our markets serve critical functions, and the point of regulation, and this is the way our markets have grown, the point of regulation really falls most heavily on the intermediaries. The intermediaries are responsible for clearing, they operate the exchanges, they're responsible for surveillance to ensure that there's no manipulation and trading isn't disrupted. They ensure the availability of funds. So we have licensed entities that are responsible for ensuring the integrity of the market and protecting and safeguarding customer funds. And I believe we have a pretty robust system for doing that. It's not foolproof. By no means is our system foolproof, but it works pretty well. And if you give your money to an exchange and trade on an exchange, I'm not aware of any exchange that's stolen anybody's money. The concerns that I've heard about DeFi markets and why centralized financial markets and why DeFi in cryptocurrency is advantageous is the alternative there is unlicensed exchanges. You're dealing with exchanges that aren't licensed. Many of the concerns that have been raised regarding trading of cryptocurrencies, whatever, on centralized markets actually concern unregulated centralized markets. Our regulated centralized markets, the CME or the ICE or the exchanges, they can't change the rules willy-nilly. They go through the approval process with the CFTC. Their rule books are public. If they want to change their rule books, they have to get regulatory approval, subject to regulatory review. The safeguarding of customer funds, even in instances where futures commission merchants have gone bankrupt and blown up or committed fraud or whatever regulatory violations, customer funds have been secured. This regulatory system of intermediaries is really not for the protection of the intermediaries, but it's for the protection of the customers and the market participants. Our markets weathered the COVID pandemic pretty well. They weren't perfect, but they weathered it pretty well. And I think there's a high degree of confidence in our regulated markets. Our capital formation and our risk management markets are some of the strongest in the world. Can they be improved? Yes, they can be improved. And can new technology come along and do a lot of things better? I certainly hope so. And there's a lot of promise. My concern is if in an unregulated system where nobody is accountable and if the customer is out on their own, that model doesn't work very well. Absent intermediaries, the point of regulate, either you're going to have a protocol that addresses the issue, but not all our regulation falls on the intermediaries either. Some of it falls on the market participants themselves. So absent an intermediary, the burden of regulation, of reporting, of record keeping, of ensuring positions aren't too large may fall or would fall directly on the market participants. So it's not as if you could take the intermediaries out and there's no regulation. There will still be regulation of the market participants, and they will be left to cope with the regulatory system on their own. In that regard, with respect to our markets, the Commodity Exchange Act and our regulation don't just make it, if you unlawful to trade a futures contract not on a registered market. Now, typically, that prohibition, we have enforced it against would-be exchanges or entities that are performing the function of an exchange that are not licensed. So we're saying you are offering futures contracts in an unlicensed platform, and therefore we bring enforcement actions. And we've done that for cryptocurrencies, unlicensed trading of options, unlicensed trading of futures. We'll go after the person that's essentially operating an unlicensed exchange. But at the same time, that contract itself, it's unlawful to enter into the contract. The participant who is entering into the futures contract, that's an illegal contract. We typically have not gone after those individuals. We'll go after the person who's facilitating the trading. So now, if you have a system where you take out the intermediary and you just have a bunch of people trading contracts, those contracts are still in violation of the Commodity Exchange Act. So I don't think that in the long run, and I think maybe some of your previous panelists were alluding to this, if you want to get institutional liquidity and make the financial markets work for mainstream America, for American businesses and American consumers, you have to solve the problem of the legality of the contracts. You have to trade contracts in a legal manner, because businesses and consumers and major financial institutions aren't going to be able to trade or won't want to take legal risks of trading contracts that are unlawful under our statutes. So there's the problem of the intermediaries, but there's also the underlying problem of it's not just the intermediaries that are regulated, it's the instruments themselves and the people trading them as well. And so that's the whole problem that needs to be addressed, I believe.
Right. Yeah, you raise an interesting point. It's not just intermediaries, it's also the actual market participants that have different responsibilities, as well as the stakeholders, potentially institutional, that would have different fiduciary responsibilities that they have to answer to. So it's much more than just the intermediaries. 100%. You mentioned the different, the robust, frameworks existent today. And that actually brings me to, Gary Gensler, who was the chairman of the CFTC in the early 2010, implemented the first kind of comprehensive market surveillance system, specifically focusing on cross-market surveillance. Do you see that the CFTC and SEC might push for something similar when it comes to the crypto markets?
Well, we're as we do typically on various market issues with all sorts of types of instruments, we consult and collaborate with the SEC and our fellow regulators. Secretary Treasury Yellen has had a number of meetings with the Financial Stability Oversight Council on these types of issues. There was a meeting yesterday on stablecoins. So we're working closely with all our regulators, including the SEC. We've been in consultation with them on cryptocurrencies, specifically sharing data to the extent we can. And frankly, in this area, I think there's great potential to the extent that transactions are conducted on an open blockchain or something to that effect. That can greatly help both us and the SEC in our market oversight. That if there's this additional public chain, there's public analyses of who's doing what, that you can just get on open source, and that's really a fantastic source of information. So we're working, we are working with our fellow regulators and the SEC in particular.
That's interesting to hear, and you mentioned a positive aspect right now of the transparency and visibility that the blockchain offers to regulators. And the entire conversation we thus far, we mainly focused on kind of the challenges and the regulation and the hurdles we need to pass. So I want to ask, what are some other positive points you think DeFi offers? What gets you excited about it as a regulator, as someone who has been his entire life involved with capital formation? Love to hear your thoughts there.
So as I've personally tried to learn more about the technologies and what the promise or the potential of DeFi is, I'm struck by if you can actually get in code, in immutable code, or you can change it obviously, but if you can get it in the code, a number of these functions that are currently done by people, if you can code in surveillance functions, certainly you can code in a settlement. Let me separate the two things. One is surveillance. Two is the back office. So one is definitely the back office improvements. We have a pretty good system, but it's still T+1, T+2. The other last Veterans Day, we were told, veterans, it was on a Wednesday, and we were told, well, the banks are going to be closed on Wednesday, and there's going to be this lag in getting the settlement funds to the banks because all the banks are closed. And I said, well, what is the difference does it make whether a banker is open or not, whether you get settlement funds transferred? I mean, the computers don't like shut down for the Veterans Day. I mean, what is it? Well, yeah, apparently they do, or whatever it is. There was this gap. And so I mean, if you have a system that doesn't need all manual people there, banks to be open or whatever, so much the better. If you can speed up your settlement time and have your records automatically encoded at the time the transaction is done, great. Surveillance is another area that we've mentioned.
Commissioner, maybe I'll just interject here. When you said surveillance, I want to just clarify here something at least that we've been noticing in the market, especially as it comes to the world of DeFi. Oftentimes surveillance is a term that folks are concerned with. But really, the way we discuss surveillance is about risk mitigation, fraud prevention. It's something that any player, and then you mentioned this earlier, if you're executing anything on any DeFi platform, at the end of the day, you want to know that someone has your back. If you're meeting an order on the other side of the book that is malicious in nature, that someone is able to prevent that. And so I just want to, especially when we're with an audience of DeFi, I want to make sure they understand surveillance has clear benefits to it, even for the most totalitarian, participant.
Our surveillance. When I talk about surveillance, I'm not Big Brother type of surveillance or spying. It's really data, and let me call it data analysis. Okay, market data analysis is what it is. We have a division of market surveillance and oversight. That means we're looking at the market. It's got the spy overtone to it. So I think market data analysis is a much better term that I'll use. But that's basically it. It's market data analysis. On the previous panel, one of the points was made about how does it fit in. I just want to point out that our regulatory system, as well as the securities markets, have accommodated every single technological revolution of the past 50 years. We've moved from pit trading to computer trading. We've moved from physical commodities to financial commodities. We've moved from futures to swaps. The road's been bumpy, and there's been this, but you look at who the exchanges are today, they're CME and ICE. They were their disruptors in their day. They disrupted the old system of pit trading with computer trading. And there were questions about, in computer trading, well, if computers are trading, where's the broker? I mean, who's responsible when two computers trade? The questions now are new, but it's not unprecedented that there have been new questions. And the regulators in each instance have worked with the community to come up to, as necessary, to modify. If you can show, ours is a principles-based regulatory system. You have to show that the market is, the contracts are not susceptible to manipulation, that there's orderly trading, that there's published data, that people can have the terms of the contracts before they trade. We have all these principles that entities have to satisfy to be able to trade. Now, if you can show that you can provide these objectives to the market through protocols rather than people, more power. So much the better. And we're not going, oh no, you have to have a division with 5 people. Our regulations don't say that. You have to satisfy the various functions. So to the extent that protocols can do it, to the extent that you can take out an intermediary of this or that, that's something that could work. But it'll take some effort because our regulations just haven't been designed for this. for the way these applications are evolving. So I just urge folks to come in and educate us, and look at our regulations and say, well, we've got, how does this fit in, and start the dialogue. We have three main in our purposes. Section 3 of the Commodity Exchange Act, the purposes are prevent systemic risk, preserve market integrity, promote responsible innovation, and fair competition amongst exchanges and market participants. So we encouraging more markets with more liquidity and competition among markets is a core function of ours, but it has to be fair competition and responsible innovation. The competition being fair means you can't have like an unregulated compete with a regulated, and responsible means it has to come along with customer protection and ensuring that innovation comes with customer protection and doesn't create systemic risk. So I think it can be accommodated. There's a lot of work to do. It's a lot of rolling up the sleeves and working with regulators and figuring it out, but it can be done. It has been done, and to be successful, I think it needs to be done.
Yeah, and it sounds like, as you mentioned, there's also room for innovation in how regulators might work with different on-chain protocols and procedures in order to gain more direct visibility into kind of the DeFi trading ecosystem, which is super exciting. And that maybe takes me to kind of my next question. Last year you mentioned the CFTC will probably require more mandate and budget in order to really tackle and take a deeper dive into the realm of digital assets. And that was last year, before we had such a spike in trading volumes of DeFi. Do you expect it's something that will be kind of on the map in the near future? How does that also corresponds with the potential of regulators being able to work more closely with on-chain protocols? I would assume it requires some very specific kind of knowledge base, human capital, technologies to employ. What are your thoughts there?
Right, but you've identified, and we did discuss last year, the budgetary challenge which we do face. Now, we did get in last year's budget, and we're very, very thankful for the Congress for providing about a 10% increase in our budget last year. But all our markets are expanding, and we have very broad responsibilities. So we're stretched pretty thin. I believe we are committed. We have the lab CFTC, and we are committed to these markets as to any other markets, and meeting our regulatory responsibilities as I've just described them. In terms of their calls, I think we mentioned last year, there are calls for us to assume greater responsibilities. I think in some members of the community, they'd like to see much greater CFTC involvement. They in terms of the spot market, that there should be some regulation of the spot market. It's the Wild West out there, and maybe the CFTC should be the regulator. That we would need a significant budgetary increase if we were to really be the regulator, or take on an expanded role. Right now, we have to pick and choose where we're going to take our enforcement actions amongst all the various possibilities out there. We try our best, but we're budget limited. So if for a significantly expanded CFTC role, we're still going to need, although we've gotten some budget increase, we would still need a significant increase. But if to us to take on those additional responsibilities, we need congressional direction to do it. We just couldn't say, okay, we're going to all of a sudden do this. Congress presumably would authorize or tell us to do it, and hopefully at that time, if they choose to give us additional responsibilities, hopefully they provide us the resources to do it.
Well, Commissioner Berkovitz, we spoke about the challenges, the opportunities, and we're right about time. But what I want to ask before we're finishing, and it's very hard to tell what's going to happen next year or in 10 years when it comes to our realm of digital assets. But I want to ask, what do you think we'll be talking about next year and in 10 years in DACOM? We asked the same question last year. We love, ending on that specific note. So love to hear your thoughts there.
Well, I'm optimistic. I've seen the spectrum as I look around and I see what's going on. I see the spectrum of activity out in the marketplace, from entities that don't want to have anything to do with regulation to entities saying, no, we want to come in and we think actually regulation will be to our advantage because we think that will give us the regulatory approval and therefore be able to attract the institutional investors and really go for it. I believe we're going to actually see some of that materialize. I'd be surprised, let me put it this way, I'd be surprised if we didn't. And I'm not speaking for anything that I know that an applicant is coming in or whatever, but this is my sense of it, that 12 months from now, we will have people coming into us and say, we want to do it through the regulatory system. How can we make it work? We'll start to actually flesh it out as to how we can do this.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's about creating a line in the sand between those that are able to say we have demonstrable clean markets and those that don't. And generally, I would agree with you that those that are able to demonstrate clean markets are those that are possibly going to win the institutional flow. Commissioner, always a pleasure to have you, truly. Thank you again for taking the time, and hopefully in person, maybe, next year.
I look forward to that. Thank you again. Appreciate this opportunity to address. And I just say to all your audience, we're an open agency. Unfortunately, you can't come down to the building in Washington yet, but you can get us by email and Zoom and whatever. So please contact us. We're here. We're actually here to build markets safely. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much to Asaf and the Commissioner for such an insightful conversation. Another big thank you to all of our attendees tuning in. If you do want to rewatch any of today's sessions, we'll be sending out the video in the coming days. We hope you can join us tomorrow to hear from Joe Lubin and another fantastic panel lineup discussing the future of digital asset trading venues. After FTX's recent raise announcement, it should be a very interesting conversation. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. We'll leave it there.